Okay, you guys, we have made it to the last lesson in this module. This lesson is on absolute opposites and absolute value. So when we talk about opposites, opposite numbers are the same distance from zero. The sum of opposites is zero. So examples would be -5 and 5. Those are opposite numbers. And then the opposite of 0 is 0. So if I ask you what the opposite of 3 is, you would tell me -3. If I ask you what the opposite of 7 is, okay, 7's right here, the opposite of 7 would be -7. If I ask you what the opposite of -4 is, you would say 4. Okay, so opposite numbers are the same distance from 0. Now, rational numbers can also be opposites. For example, 2 3/4, that's right here on our number line. Okay, you can see 2 3/4. The opposite of that would be -2 3/4. And the way that you know that two numbers are opposites is the sum. So when you add them together, you get 0. So if you add two numbers together and you get 0, you know that they are opposites. Okay, so I want you to take just a minute and I want you to do this activity on your own paper. So if you don't have paper out yet, get out a piece of paper, create a number line showing the integers from -5 to 5. Remember, integers are all of the whole numbers and their opposites. And then I want you to graph 5 and its opposite on the number line you created. Graph -3 and its opposite on the number line you created. And graph 1.5 and its opposite on the number line you created. So go ahead and push pause for just a second and work on this activity, and then push play once you have it done. Okay, so your number line should look like this. This is a number line showing the integers from -5 to 5. 5 and -5. So if here's 5, the opposite of 5 would be -5. So somehow on your number line, you should have shown that 5 and -5 are opposites. And then -3 and 3, those would be opposites. And then 1.5, 1.5 is right here in between 1 and 2. And the opposite of that would be -1.5, which would be right in between -1 and -2. Okay, so if I ask you what the opposite of 15 is, you would say -15. If I ask you what the opposite of -15 is, you would say +15. Now on this next one, it says, how do you read the expression? And then there is a negative sign in 4. So you could say this is the opposite of 4. Okay, whenever there is a negative sign in front of a number, we say that it is the opposite of the number. So if we were to simplify the opposite of 4, well, the opposite of 4 would be -4. Okay, on the next one, how do you read the expression, the opposite of -2? So if we're talking about the opposite of -2 right here, the opposite of -2 would be +2. On the next one, it says, write the opposite of -1.3, then simplify. So if we're doing the opposite of -1.3, that's going to look like this. And if we have our number line here, and this is 0, and this is -1.3, the opposite of -1.3 would be +1.3. Okay, so this right here, the opposite of -1.3 would be +1.3. Okay, the next thing we need to talk about is absolute value. Absolute value means how far away a number is from 0 on the number line. So when we talk about absolute value is a distance from 0. Okay, so if we look at these two numbers right here, 6 and -6, we can see that 6 is 6 spaces away from 0 on the number line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If we were to count the spaces, 6 is 6 spaces away from 0 on the number line. So the absolute value of 6 would be 6. Okay? Now, if we look at the number negative 6, even though this number is negative, if we count the number of spaces that negative 6 is away from 0 on the number line, negative 6 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Positive 6 spaces. So the absolute value of negative 6 is positive 6. Whenever you find the absolute value of a number, because it's a distance away from 0 on the number line, you're always going to end up with something positive. And the way that you show absolute value in math is by using these two lines right here. Okay, so you guys can see that these two lines right here, that means we're finding the absolute value of the number within those two lines. Okay, let's move on to activity 2. Letter A says, how many numbers have an absolute value equal to 8? Okay, so when it says how many numbers have an absolute value equal to 8, well, that would be 2 numbers. If we have 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 is 8 spaces away from 0 on the number line. And then negative 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Negative 8 is also 8 spaces away from 0 on the number line. So the absolute value of 8 would be 8, and the absolute value of negative 8 would also be 8. Okay? How many numbers have an absolute value equal to 2/3? Well, that would be 2. 2/3 right here is 2/3 away from 0 on the number line. And also, negative 2/3 is 2/3 away from 0 on the number line. So the absolute value of 2/3 is 2/3. And the absolute value of negative 2/3 is also 2/3. Okay. How many numbers have an absolute value equal to 0? Well, that would just be 0. How many numbers have an absolute value equal to negative 10? None. Whenever we are finding the absolute value of a number, we always end up with something positive, because absolute value is a distance, and distance is always positive. So when we say how many numbers have an absolute value equal to negative 10, we would say none. Now the absolute value of negative 10 would be positive 10. Okay, negative 10 is 10 spaces away from 0 on the number line. Okay, on this next part, we just need to simplify. The absolute value of negative 4 would be 4. If we were to count the number of spaces that negative 4 is away from 0 on the number line, so if this is 0, this is negative 1, 2, 3, 4. Negative 4 is 4 spaces away from 0 on the number line. So that means the absolute value of negative 4 is positive 4. For B, the absolute value of 4 would be 4. The absolute value of 1 is 1. The absolute value of 3.5 is just 3.5. The absolute value of negative 3.5 is positive 3.5. The absolute value of 0 is just 0. Now this one right here, this is a little bit tricky because it's saying the opposite of the absolute value of 20. Okay, so the absolute value of 20 is 20. It's 20 spaces away from 0 on the number line. And then the opposite of that would actually give us a negative 20. Okay, now on H, this one is a little bit tricky again. It is asking us to find the opposite of the absolute value of negative 20. So we know the absolute value of negative 20 is positive 20, And then the opposite of that would be negative 20. Okay, and then the last one, the opposite of the absolute value of 1.1. Well, the absolute value of 1.1 is 1.1, and then the opposite of that would be negative 1.1. Okay, so activity 4. I want you guys to go ahead and pause your video and do each of these questions on your own paper, and then push play once you've done that, and we'll go through them together. So go ahead and push pause, take a minute, work through these on your own paper, and then push play. Okay, so it says determine whether the following statements are always true, sometimes true, or never true. Justify your answers. The absolute value of a number is greater than the number. Well, if we have the absolute value of 7, that's just going to be 7. So in this case, the absolute value of a number is greater than the number. That wouldn't be true. Okay, but if you have the absolute value of negative 7, that's going to be equal to positive 7. That is true. This right here is true in that case. 7 is greater than negative 7. So in this one, you should have said sometimes true, depending on what the number is. Because if you're taking the absolute value of a negative number, this statement right here is going to be true. B, the absolute value of a number is the number's opposite. That is never true. Okay, the absolute value of a number is the number's opposite. Well, sorry, I'm going to say sometimes true. Because when you are taking the absolute value of a negative number, like the absolute value of negative 6 is going to be positive 6, and negative 6 and positive 6, those are opposites, aren't they? Or if you're taking the absolute value of negative 4, that's going to be positive 4. Those are opposites. But if you're taking the absolute value of 7, that's going to be 7. Notice how they're not opposites. So that one is sometimes true. The absolute value of a negative number is greater than the number. And that is going to be true. Always. Because if you're taking the absolute value of a negative number, you're always going to end up with something positive, and a positive number will always be greater than a negative number. Okay, D, there are always two numbers with the same absolute value. That is true. Okay, opposites have the same absolute value, and every single number we can write on the number line has an opposite. Opposites have the same absolute value. That is true. And then the absolute value of a positive number is a negative number. That is never true. Okay, absolute value is always positive. Okay, now the next thing that I need you to do is on your own piece of paper, I want you to do each of these questions 1 through 14. So you're going to push pause, you're going to do these questions, and then you're going to push play and look at the answer key and see if you got these correct. If not, please come ask me for some help. Okay, so let's go ahead and have you push pause, work through these problems, and then push play to see if you got them right. Okay, here we go. It says use the number line below to answer the questions. Is the value of A positive or negative? Well, we can see right here A is to the left of 0 on the number line, so that is going to mean that A is some negative number. Is the distance from 0 to A positive or negative? And on that one we would say positive. The distance from here to here would be positive. Distance is always positive. On number 2, what number or numbers, if any, make this statement true? So on number 2, this is saying the absolute value of what is going to be equal to 16. And in that case, there are two answers, negative 16 and positive 16. because the absolute value of negative 16 is 16, and the absolute value of positive 16 is also 16. What number or numbers, if any, make the statement true? So the absolute value of what number equals a negative 9? That would be none. Absolute value never equals a negative number. What number or numbers, if any, make the statement true? The absolute value of 0 is 0, and then give two numbers with an absolute value greater than 3. So we could say the absolute value of negative 7, because that would be 7. We could have the absolute value of 4, because that would be 4. We could have the absolute value of negative 10, because that would be 10. So you just needed to come up with two numbers, and I just gave you an example of 3. Okay, and then on the last part, simplify. The absolute value of 5 is 5. The absolute value of negative 5 is 5. The absolute value of negative 250 is positive 250. The absolute value of negative 3 9/10 is positive 3 9/10. The absolute value of 11.06 is positive 11.06. The absolute value of 11/12 is 11/12. Now on this one, the opposite of the absolute value of negative 18. So on this, the absolute value of negative 18 is 18, and then the opposite of that is negative 18. Okay, for this one, the absolute value of 18 is 18, and then the opposite of that is negative 18. And then the absolute value of negative 18 would be positive 18. Okay, so now from here, I need you to go to your next Canvas lesson, which is the absolute values learning activity. And then you're going to have the opposites and absolute value ALEKS assignment, and then you will be done with this module.